The forest doesn't forget. Every footprint, every broken branch, every drop of blood that seeps into the moss-covered ground becomes part of its memory. And sometimes, when the wind moves through the pines in just the right way, it whispers those memories back to those foolish enough to listen. I've spent 15 years collecting stories from park rangers across North America. What you are about to hear isn't folklore passed down through generations or campfire tales designed to scare teenagers. These are first-hand accounts from trained professionals, people who've dedicated their lives to protecting our wilderness, people who don't scare easily, people who, after what they experienced, had to make a choice, continue their work while carrying an unbearable knowledge, or walk away from the forest they loved because some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. Before we begin, ask yourself this: have you ever felt washed in the woods? That prickling sensation on the back of your neck, the certainty that something just beyond your peripheral vision is observing your every move? Most people dismiss it as paranoia, an evolutionary holdover from when humans were prey. But what if, in some places, we still are? Let me share something that might disturb you. According to the National Park Service, over 1,500 people vanish in America's national parks and forests every year. That's more than 4 people every single day. Many are found, but hundreds aren't. They disappear so completely that it's as if the earth simply swallowed them whole. No bodies, no evidence, no explanation. Just absence. The official term is missing 411, a phenomenon so disturbing that several books have been written trying to understand the pattern. But patterns suggest logic, and what you're about to hear defies every logical explanation. The first story comes from a ranger I'll call Michael, who worked in Olympic National Park in Washington State. Olympic is nearly 1 million acres of temperate rainforest, glacier-capped mountains, and coastlines so remote that entire beaches can only be reached by hiking through old-growth forest, where trees have stood for over 1,000 years. It's a place where nature still holds dominion, where human presence feels like an intrusion rather than a right. Michael had been with the Park Service for 8 years when it happened. It was late October, the season when most tourists have gone home and the forest settles into its winter silence. He was conducting a routine patrol along one of the backcountry trails, checking campsites and monitoring wildlife activity. The day was overcast, the kind of gray that makes the forest feel compressed, as if the sky is pressing down on the canopy. He'd covered about 12 miles when he noticed something unusual. There was a smell, not the earthy scent of decomposition or the musk of elk that usually permeated the forest. This was different, sweet, almost floral, but with an underlying note of copper, like flowers arranged around fresh meat. Michael's training kicked in immediately. Unusual smells can indicate everything from illegal drug operations to animal carcasses that might attract dangerous predators. He had to investigate. He followed the scent-off trail, marking his path carefully. This is crucial to understand. Park rangers are trained extensively in navigation. They don't get lost. They carry GPS, compasses, maps. They know the land. Michael had walked this section of forest dozens of times, but as he pushed through the undergrowth, following that strange, sweet copper smell, the forest began to feel wrong. The trees seemed taller, their trunks darker. The spacing between them felt deliberate, almost architectural, as if he'd stumbled into a natural cathedral. The ground beneath his feet changed from the typical moss and fern-covered forest floor to something harder, more compact. When he looked down, he saw why. The earth was covered in a thick mat of what looked like pale fungi, thousands of small, white mushrooms forming an almost solid carpet. They seemed to pulse slightly, though there might have been a trick of the dim light filtering through the canopy. The smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. Michael pulled his radio to call in his location, but all he got was static. Not unusual in the dense forest, but unsettling nonetheless. He checked his GPS. The screen showed his position as a blue dot on the map, but the terrain around him didn't match what the topography suggested should be there. According to his device, he should be standing on a steep slope, but the ground beneath him was perfectly level. That's when he heard the breathing. It came from everywhere and nowhere. A slow, rhythmic sound like massive lungs inflating and deflating. Michael froze, his hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt. But he could see no source. The breathing continued, patient and steady, and with each exhale, the white mushrooms at his feet seemed to release a small puff of spores that hung in the air like mist. He should have left then. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and retrace his steps. But rangers are trained to investigate, to document, to protect. So he moved forward, pushing through a curtain of hanging moss, and found himself in a clearing he'd never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood a structure. Not a building, exactly, but not entirely natural either. Massive stones, each easily 15 feet tall, arranged in a rough circle. They were covered in the same white fungi, and between them, the air seemed to shimmer like heat waves over summer asphalt. Michael approached slowly, his camera out, documenting everything. The breathing sound was louder here, resonating from the stones themselves. Then he saw the clothes. Scattered around the stones were items of clothing: a child's pink jacket, a hiking boot, a torn flannel shirt, a backpack with a name written on it in permanent marker. Michael recognized that name. It belonged to a hiker who had disappeared in this area 3 years ago. A massive search had been conducted. Hundreds of volunteers, dogs, helicopters. Nothing had been found. But here was her backpack, sitting on the white fungi as if it had been placed there yesterday. Michael's hands were shaking as he photographed everything. He needed evidence. He needed proof that he'd found something connected to a missing person. But as he reached down to pick up the backpack, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no wind, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just silence so complete that Michael could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. And then, from behind the stones, something moved. He didn't get a clear look at it. His mind couldn't quite process what he was seeing. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it seemed to be made of the same material as the forest itself. Bark and moss and something else. Something that moved with a liquid grace that no tree should possess. It had no face that he could see, but he knew it was looking at him. He could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against his chest. Michael ran. He crashed through the forest, not caring about his marked path, not caring about protocol or documentation. He just ran. Branches tore at his face and hands. His lungs burned. Behind him, he could hear something moving through the trees, not running but keeping pace effortlessly, as if the forest itself was following him. The sound of breaking branches, the rustle of disturbed undergrowth, and underneath it all, that breathing, deep and patient. He burst out onto the trail he left what felt like hours ago. Though his watch showed only 20 minutes had passed, the forest behind him was silent and still. Whatever had been following him had stopped at the trail's edge, as if there was an invisible boundary it wouldn't cross. Michael didn't stop running until he reached his truck, 5 miles away. When he reported what he'd found, a search team was dispatched to locate the clearing. Michael led them to the spot where he'd left the trail. They searched for 6 hours, using his GPS coordinates and his detailed description. They found nothing. No clearing, no stones, no white fungi. Just normal forest, normal terrain that matched exactly what the topographic maps predicted. The official report listed his account as a possible stress reaction, a hallucination brought on by dehydration or exhaustion. But Michael knows what he saw. He still works for the Park Service, but he won't go into that section of forest anymore. And sometimes, on quiet nights, he says he can still smell it. That sweet copper scent drifting through his window, reminding him that the forest remembers. Here's something you should know about Olympic National Park. In the past 30 years, 23 people have disappeared there without a trace. 23 people who simply walked into the trees and never walked out. Search and rescue teams, some of the best in the world, found no evidence of what happened to them. But perhaps that's because they were looking for logical explanations. Perhaps they should have been looking for clearings that shouldn't exist. The second story takes us to Yosemite National Park in California. Yosemite is famous for its stunning granite cliffs, its waterfalls, its giant sequoias. Over 4 million people visit every year, making it one of the most popular national parks in America. But popularity doesn't mean safety. In fact, the more people who enter a wilderness area, the more opportunities there are for something to go wrong, or for something to go right, depending on your perspective. This account comes from a ranger named Sarah, who was part of the park's high-angle rescue team. These are the people who rappel down cliff faces to save injured climbers, who navigate treacherous terrain that would terrify most people. Sarah had been doing this work for 6 years. She'd seen injuries, fatalities, accidents of every kind. She thought she'd seen everything the mountains could throw at her. In August, a call came in about a missing hiker. A woman in her 30s, experienced, well-equipped, hiking alone on the mist trail. She checked in with the ranger station that morning, saying she'd be back by 3 in the afternoon. When she didn't return by nightfall, her friends reported her missing. A search began immediately. Sarah was part of the team that swept the trail the next morning. The mist trail is popular and well-maintained, carved into the granite alongside Vernal Fall. It's steep with over 600 steps, but it's not particularly dangerous if you stay on the path. There's only one major hazard: the waterfall itself. Several people have died over the years by getting too close to the edge, where the wet rocks and powerful current can sweep you over the 400-foot drop. The team found her pack about halfway up the trail, sitting neatly on one of the stone steps. Inside was everything she should have had with her: water, food, extra clothes, first aid kit. Her ID and phone were in the pack, but she was nowhere to be found. What disturbed Sarah was how the pack had been placed. It wasn't dropped or discarded. It was set down carefully, almost ceremonially, in the exact center of the step, and beside it, scratched into the granite with something sharp, was a symbol. Sarah had seen a lot of graffiti in the parks, initials and dates and hearts. But this was different. It was a circle with 7 lines radiating outward, each line ending in a smaller circle. Sarah photographed it and continued the search. They searched for 3 days, dogs, drones, volunteers calling her name until their voices went hoarse. Nothing. The woman had simply vanished. On the 4th day, as the search was being scaled back, Sarah returned to the spot where the pack had been found. Something was bothering her about that symbol. She'd seen it before, she was certain, but couldn't remember where. She sat on the steps, looking at the waterfall thundering beside her, miscoating her face, and tried to think. The sound of the water was hypnotic, a constant roar that seemed to fill her entire head. And then, just for a moment, the sound changed. It wasn't just water anymore. It was voices. Hundreds of them, all whispering the same word over and over. She couldn't quite make it out, but it sounded like a name, an old name, something from a language she didn't recognize. Sarah stood up quickly, her heart racing. The voices were gone, just water again. She must have been hearing things, a trick of the acoustics. But as she turned to leave, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On every stone step, descending from where the pack had been found all the way down to the trail below, someone had scratched the same symbol. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all identical, and they hadn't been there before. Sarah was certain of it. She'd walked up these exact steps that morning. She would have noticed. Her radio crackled. Another team member asking for her position. Sarah responded automatically, but her eyes were fixed on the symbols. They seemed to move slightly in her peripheral vision, the lines writhing like living things. She pulled out her camera to document them. Through the viewfinder, she saw something that wasn't visible to her naked eye. Sitting on the bottom step, maybe 50 feet away, was a figure. It was hunched over, impossibly thin, with arms too long and joints that bent in wrong directions. Its skin, if you could call it that, was the same color as the granite, making it nearly invisible against the stone. And it was looking directly at her. Sarah lowered the camera. The figure was gone. She raised it again. There it was, closer now, perhaps 30 feet away, Lower the camera. Gone. Raise it 20 feet away. She could see details now. It had no face, just smooth stone where features should be. But somehow, she knew it was smiling. She didn't lower the camera again. She backed away slowly, keeping the thing in frame. It moved with her, matching her pace exactly, always staying the same distance away. Through the viewfinder, she could see other figures now, emerging from the rocks around the trail. Dozens of them, all the same gray granite color, all moving with that same liquid grace. Sarah's foot caught on her root and she stumbled. The camera swung wildly, and when she got it steady again, the figures were surrounding her, close enough to touch, still smiling with their non-existent mouths. And then, very clearly through her camera speaker, she heard it again. That whispered name, but this time she could make it out. Her name. They were whispering her name. Sarah dropped the camera and ran. She didn't stop until she reached the ranger station, where her team members found her hyperventilating, her hands scraped and bleeding from where she caught herself on the rocks. She tried to explain what she'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. They sounded insane, even to her own ears. A team went back to check the trail. They found her camera smashed on the rocks. The symbols on the steps were gone, just smooth, weathered granite worn by thousands of footsteps. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was the footage on the camera's memory card. When they reviewed it, they saw the steps, the waterfall, the symbols. But where Sarah had seen the granite figures, there was nothing. Just empty trail, except in one frame. A single frame, captured just before the camera was dropped, where you can see something in the background. It's blurry, but it's there. A shape that doesn't quite match the rocks around it. A shape that, if you look at it long enough, starts to look almost human. Sarah left the Park Service shortly after. She won't discuss what happened in detail, but she'll tell you this: cameras see things we don't. Lenses capture wavelengths of light invisible to the human eye. Maybe, she says, there are things in the wilderness that exist just outside our perception. Things that have always been there, watching from behind the veil of what we can see, waiting for the right moment to show themselves. The missing woman was never found. But here's something disturbing. When they went through the park's historical records, they found 17 other disappearances on that exact stretch of trail, going back over 80 years. All of them solo hikers, all of them experienced. And in 6 of the cases, their packs were found sitting neatly on the steps, as if carefully placed there by someone or something that wanted them found. What would you do if you looked through a camera and saw something that wasn't there with your naked eye? Would you keep looking, trying to understand? Or would you drop the camera and run, choosing ignorance over knowledge? Sometimes, the things we don't see are blessings, not limitations. Our third story comes from the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota. This is over 1 million acres of pristine forest and interconnected lakes, one of the most remote wilderness areas in the continental United States. There are no roads here, no buildings, no cell service, just water, trees, and wildlife. It's a place where you can paddle for days without seeing another human being. A place where, if something goes wrong, you're entirely on your own. The ranger who shared this story asked to remain completely anonymous. I'll call him Juan Alberto. He was conducting a solo patrol in late September, checking the condition of campsites and portage trails before the winter freeze. This is standard procedure. Rangers often work alone in remote areas, relying on their training and satellite phones for safety. Juan Alberto had been paddling for 3 days, moving from lake to lake, when he noticed something odd. On every portage trail he crossed, he found a single boot print in the mud. Always the same boot, based on the tread pattern, always pointing in the direction he was heading, as if someone was just ahead of him, moving through the wilderness with purpose. This should have been impossible. Juan Alberto had the permit records for this section of the Boundary Waters. He was the only person authorized to be in this area during this period. The final canoe groups of the season had exited 5 days earlier, These tracks were fresh, no more than a few hours old. He started paying closer attention. The tracks appeared consistently, always on portages, never around campsites. Whoever was making them was moving efficiently, not stopping to rest or camp. And they were moving fast. Juan Alberto was an experienced paddler, covering 20 miles a day. But these tracks suggested someone moving even faster, always staying just ahead of him. On the fourth day, Juan Alberto found the first cache. It was on a portage between the small lakes, hidden off the trail under a pile of carefully ranged stones. Inside were supplies. Not modern supplies, but old things. A rusted knife, a cloth bundle containing dried meat that looked decades old, a leather journal so deteriorated that it fell apart when he touched it, and a photograph surprisingly well preserved in a waterproof pouch. The photograph showed a group of people standing beside a canoe. They were dressed in early 20th century clothing, sturdy wool and canvas. 7 people total. But someone had taken a knife to the photograph and scratched out 6 of the faces, leaving only one person visible. A man, tall and gaunt, staring directly at the camera with eyes that seemed bright to intense. Juan Alberto photographed everything and continued his patrol. But that night, camped on a small island in the middle of a lake, he heard something that made him question his sanity. Singing coming across the water. A man's voice, deep and resonant, singing in a language Juan Alberto didn't recognize. The words rose and fell with a strange rhythm, almost hypnotic. And with each verse, the voice got closer. Juan Alberto grabbed his flashlight and scanned the water. Nothing. Just darkness and the gentle lap of waves against the shore. But the singing continued, circling his island, moving counterclockwise around him. He could hear a paddle dipping in the water now. The steady stroke of someone moving through the darkness. Then the singing stopped. In the sudden silence, Juan Alberto could hear his own breathing, harsh and fast. He waited, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, scanning the water. And then he saw it. A canoe, maybe 50 feet from shore. Old, wooden, the kind you'd see in a museum. And sitting in it, perfectly still, was a figure. The man from the photograph. Same gaunt face, same intense eyes. But he was wrong somehow. His skin had a grayish tint, and he sat still, without the small movements of balance that even experienced paddlers unconsciously make. The figure raised one long arm and pointed at Juan Alberto, held the gesture for a long moment. Then, without using a paddle, without any visible means of propulsion, the canoe began to move. It glided silently across the water, picking up speed, heading directly for Juan Alberto's island. Juan Alberto didn't think. He grabbed his gear and scrambled into his own canoe, pushing off from shore. He paddled hard, not caring about direction, just trying to get distance between himself and that thing in the ancient canoe. When he looked back, the figure was following him, matching his speed exactly. That arm still outstretched, still pointing. They moved across the lake in a strange procession, Juan Alberto paddling with everything he had, the figure gliding behind him without effort. And as they moved, that singing started again. But this time, it was coming from all around him, echoing across the water from every direction. Dozens of voices, all singing that same hypnotic melody. Juan Alberto shot through a narrow channel between 2 islands. His canoe scraped against rocks, and he felt it take on water. But he didn't slow down. On the other side, the main lake opened up before him, vast and dark. He paddled for the far shore, his arms burning, his lungs screaming. Behind him, the singing reached a crescendo and then cut off abruptly. He risked a glance back. The figure's canoe had stopped at the mouth of the channel, as if there was an invisible barrier it couldn't cross. Juan Alberto could see the figure clearly in the moonlight, still pointing at him. And then, very slowly, it lowered its arm and began to fade. Not paddling away, not sinking, just fading, becoming transparent, until there was nothing but empty water and starlight. Juan Alberto didn't stop paddling until dawn, when he finally pulled ashore, exhausted and shaking. He checked his GPS. He traveled 15 miles through a labyrinth of lakes and channels in complete darkness. Statistically, he should have crashed, capsized, or gotten hopelessly lost. But somehow, he navigated perfectly, as if something was guiding him. The satellite phone was in his waterlogged pack. Ruined. He had no choice but to continue his patrol route back to civilization. It took him 3 more days. During that time, he found 2 more caches, each containing similar items. Old supplies, deteriorated journals, photographs with scratched out faces. And in the last cache, he found something that changed everything. A newspaper clipping from 1921, preserved in a glass bottle. The headline, "Search Abandoned for Missing Expedition." The article detailed how a group of 7 fur traders had disappeared in the Boundary Waters. Their canoes and supplies were found scattered across several campsites, but the men themselves were never seen again. The article included a photograph of the expedition before they departed. It was the same photograph Juan Alberto had found in the first cache. The same 7 men before their faces were scratched out. And standing in the center, tall and gaunt with those intense eyes, was the man Juan Alberto had seen in the canoe. When Juan Alberto finally made it back to the ranger station, he reported everything. A team was sent to investigate. They found the caches, confirmed the historical records of the missing expedition, and documented everything. But they found no trace of the mysterious canoe or its occupant. The official theory is that Juan Alberto experienced a stress-induced hallucination, brought on by isolation and the discovery of the historical caches. His brain, they said, constructed a narrative to explain the strange artifacts he'd found. But the theory doesn't explain how he navigated 15 miles in complete darkness without capsizing. It doesn't explain the boot prints that multiple park rangers have since reported seeing on those same portage trails. And it doesn't explain the recordings, because Juan Alberto's satellite phone wasn't completely ruined. The data card survived, and when they examined it, they found audio files that had been automatically recorded when the phone detected sound. The files captured that singing, hours of it, in a language that linguistic experts couldn't identify. And in the background of those recordings, you can hear something else. Whispers. Dozens of voices, all whispering the same thing over and over. Join us. Join us. Join us. Juan Alberto doesn't work in the Boundary Waters anymore. He requested a transfer to a park with roads, visitor centers, and cell phone service. But he'll tell you this: whatever happened to that expedition in 1921, they didn't just die. Something took them. Something that still moves through those waters, adding to its collection, always looking for more to join its eternal procession across the dark lakes. Have you ever wondered what happens to the people who disappear in the wilderness? Where they go? We assume they fell, got lost, succumbed to exposure or injury. But what if some of them never left? What if they're still there, moving through the trees and water, transformed into something that's no longer quite human? The fourth story takes us to Great Smoky Mountains National Park, straddling the border between North Carolina and Tennessee. The Smokies receive more visitors than any other national park in America, over 12 million people every year. With that many people comes a statistically higher number of incidents. But statistics can't explain everything. This account comes from a seasonal ranger named David who worked in the park during the summer of 2019. David was young, enthusiastic, and new to the park service. He'd grown up hiking and camping, and he thought he understood wilderness. The Smokies would teach him otherwise. In early July, a family reported that their daughter had wandered away from their campsite. She was 9 years old, wearing a bright red jacket, and she'd been gone for less than 15 minutes before they noticed. A search began immediately. The Park Service has an excellent track record for finding missing children quickly. Kids usually don't go far, and they rarely travel in a straight line. They follow paths of least resistance, get distracted, sit down and wait. But this little girl was different. The search went on for 6 hours, then 12, then 24. Over 200 people were searching, including David. They covered every inch of forest within a 5-mile radius of the campsite. They called her name until their voices gave out. The dogs couldn't find a scent trail. It was as if she'd simply evaporated. On the second day, David was searching a steep ravine about 3 miles from the campsite when he found something strange. A circle of stones, each about the size of a human head, arranged in a perfect ring. In the center of the circle was the girl's red jacket, folded neatly, but no sign of the girl herself. David radioed it in immediately. The search focused on that area, expanding outward from the stone circle, and that's when things got disturbing. Within a 1/4-mile radius of where the jacket was found, searchers discovered 6 more stone circles, all identical, all empty except for a single item of clothing: a child's shoe, a hair ribbon, a small backpack. None of these items belonged to the missing girl. They were old, faded, rotting from exposure. Some looked like they had been there for years. The Park Service checked their records. In the past 30 years, 11 children had disappeared in that section of the Smokies. 11 children who were never found. David was part of the team that spent the night in that area, hoping the girl might see their lights and come to them. They set up a base camp in a small clearing, generator-powered lights flooding the forest. David was on watch duty from midnight to 4 in the morning. At 2:30, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Laughter. A child's laughter, high and clear, coming from the forest beyond the lights. David called out, identifying himself as a park ranger, asking the child to come toward the light. The laughter continued, moving in a circle around the camp. Other team members woke up, hearing it too. They spread out, moving toward the sound, calling the girl's name. The laughter led them deeper into the forest, always staying just ahead of them, just out of sight. David followed it down into another ravine, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And then, abruptly, the laughter stopped. David found himself alone, the sounds of his team distant and muffled. He called out, but got no response. His flashlight flickered and died. David smacked it, and it came back on. But the beam was dimmer now, barely pushing back the darkness. And in the weak light, he saw them, children, dozens of them, standing among the trees in a perfect circle around him. They were all young, maybe 6 to 12 years old, all wearing old-fashioned clothes that looked decades out of date. And they were all holding hands. David tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't work. The children just stood there, silent and still, their faces pale in the flashlight beam. And then, as one, they began to move. They closed the circle, walking in perfect synchronization, hands still linked. David backed away, but they matched his movements, maintaining the same distance, compressing the circle smaller and smaller. He could see their faces clearly now. Their eyes were wrong, to dark, like holes in their skulls. Their smiles were too wide, stretching their faces into grotesque masks. And they were all singing now, a nursery rhyme David half remembered from his own childhood, but with different words. Words about the forest, about staying forever, about joining the circle and never going home. David turned and ran. The circle broke as he crashed through it, children scattering like smoke. He ran blindly, branches tearing at his face and clothes, his breath coming in ragged gasps behind him. He could hear them, following, their footsteps impossibly light, their laughter echoing through the trees. He burst into the base camp, shouting incoherently. His team members caught him as he collapsed. They said he'd been gone for less than 5 minutes, though to David it felt like hours. They said he ran out of the forest alone, screaming about children. When they went back to look, they found his flashlight on the ground, the battery dead. But they found no children, no footprints other than David's, nothing. The girl was found the next morning, 2 miles away, sitting beside a stream. She was physically unharmed but wouldn't speak for 3 days. When she finally started talking again, she wouldn't discuss where she'd been or what had happened, but she drew pictures, dozens of them. Pictures of children holding hands in a circle, pictures of stone rings in the forest, and pictures of something tall and thin standing in the center of the circles, Something with too many arms and no face. Child psychologists said it was trauma. Her mind creating false memories to cope with the fear of being lost. But the drawings were too detailed, too consistent, and they matched descriptions from other children who'd been found after disappearing in the Smokies. Children who all told similar stories about the circle, about the singing, about being invited to join and play forever in the forest. David left the Park Service after that summer. He works in an office now, in a city, where the only trees are carefully cultivated ones in concrete planters. But sometimes, he says, he still hears it, the nursery rhyme, sung in children's voices, drifting through his dreams. And he wonders how many children didn't refuse the invitation. How many joined the circle and stayed. Here is something that will disturb you. There is a pattern to the child disappearances in the Smokies. They happen in clusters, separated by periods of years. 6 children in the 1970s, 5 in the 1980s, 7 in the 1990s. The pattern suggests something deliberate, something that emerges periodically to add to its collection. And we're overdue for the next cluster. The final story is the most disturbing, and it comes from a place I won't name specifically, because the ranger who told me this story still works there, and she fears what might happen if this place becomes known. I'll tell you, it's in the Pacific Northwest, in a forest of old-growth trees so massive that walking among them feels like being in a cathedral. Built by gods. The ranger's name is Rachel, and what happened to her happened last year. It's the most recent account I've collected, and it's still unfolding. Rachel was investigating reports of illegal camping in a remote section of the forest. Poachers and marijuana growers sometimes set up camps in areas where they're unlikely to be discovered, and part of Rachel's job is finding and documenting these sites. She'd been given coordinates for a suspected camp by a fire lookout who'd seen smoke in an area where no permitted campfires should exist. Rachel hiked in alone, which was standard practice. The area was difficult terrain, steep and heavily forested with no trails. It took her most of the day to reach the coordinates. What she found was not an illegal camp. It was a structure, not a cabin or a shelter, but something else entirely. Imagine a dome made of woven branches, each branch as thick as your arm, interlaced so tightly that you couldn't see between them. The structure was massive, at least 30 feet in diameter and 15 feet high at its peak. And it was old. The branches were gray and weathered, covered in moss and lichen, suggesting it had been there for decades. Rachel documented it extensively. There was no entrance that she could see, no gaps in the weaving. The structure sat in a small clearing, and around it, the forest was strangely silent. No birds, no insects, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth. Just silence. She walked around the structure, photographing it from every angle. And as she completed her circuit, she noticed something carved into the largest of the trees surrounding the clearing. Symbols. Hundreds of them, carved deep into the bark. They spiraled up the trunk, disappearing into the canopy. Rachel recognized a few of them from anthropology courses in college. Some were Native American. Others looked European. Still others completely unfamiliar. But they all seemed to be saying the same thing. Warning, stay away. Don't enter. Danger. Rachel should have left then. But she's a scientist, trained to investigate and document. She approached the structure, running her hands over the woven branches. They were cold to the touch, much colder than they should be. And they were wet, though it hadn't rained in days. When she pulled her hand back, her fingers were coated in something that looked like sap but smelled like iron. Like blood. She found the entrance on her second circuit. It had appeared, though she was certain it hadn't been there before. A gap in the weaving, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Rachel stood at the entrance for a long time, debating. Every instinct told her not to go in, but her radio wasn't working. Her GPS was showing errors, and she needed to understand what this structure was so she could report it properly. She went in. The interior was bigger than it should have been, far bigger than the external dimensions suggested, and it was filled with things. Objects hung from the dome ceiling on thin strands that looked like spider silk. Hundreds of objects, thousands, Personal items, watches, glasses, wallets, phones, cameras, jewelry. All the things people carry with them into the wilderness. All the things that get left behind when people disappear. Rachel moved through the space in a daze, her flashlight beam catching on familiar brands and styles. Some items were old, decades old. Others were recent. She recognized a specific brand of GPS unit that had only been on the market for 2 years. And then she saw something that made her stomach drop. Her father's watch. She recognized it instantly. Her father had disappeared while hiking in this forest 12 years ago. A massive search had found nothing. And here was his watch, hanging from the ceiling like a trophy, the band still stained with the sweat of his final day. Rachel reached for it, and as her fingers touched the metal, she heard something. A voice. Her father's voice, calling her name. She spun around, but there was no one there, just the hanging objects swaying slightly. Though there was no breeze, then all the objects began to speak, whispers at first, then growing louder. Hundreds of voices, thousands, all calling out, names, pleas, warnings. The cacophony was overwhelming, filling Rachel's head until she couldn't think. And beneath it all, something else. A deeper voice, ancient and vast, speaking in a language that predated words, speaking directly into her mind. It told her what this place was. A memory bank, a collection. Every person who had disappeared in this forest for the past 200 years, their essence is preserved in the objects they'd carried. Not dead, not alive, but trapped in the space between, their consciousness bound to the final pieces of their physical selves. And it told her she could join them, that she'd been chosen, that her presence here wasn't an accident. The structure had been calling to her, had wanted her to find it, had been waiting for her since the day her father disappeared. It wanted to add her to its collection, to preserve her essence forever. Rachel ran. She didn't remember finding the exit, didn't remember the hike back to her truck. She only remembers running through the forest while those voices chased her, calling her name, begging her to come back, to stay, to join the collection. When she finally reached civilization, she was covered in scratches and bruises. Dehydrated and incoherent, she spent days in the hospital, being treated for exposure and shock. When she tried to tell people what she'd found, they listened politely but clearly didn't believe her. The coordinates she'd been given led to normal forest. A search team found no structure, no clearing, no carved warnings on trees. But Rachel still has the photographs on her camera. They show the structure, the symbols, the hanging objects. She's shown them to me. I've seen her father's watch, suspended in that impossible space. I've seen the other objects, hundreds of them, each representing a person who walked into the forest and never came out. And here's the part that keeps me awake at night. Rachel says the structure is growing every time someone disappears in that forest. She has nightmares about the structure, and in those nightmares she can see it's gotten bigger, its collection more extensive. She's tried to get Park Service leadership to investigate, but without physical evidence of its location, they dismiss her account. She's considered going public, but she knows what would happen. She'd lose her job, her credibility, everything. So she waits and watches and hopes that she can figure out where the structure really is before it claims anyone else. Because she's certain of one thing: it's still out there, still calling to people, still adding to its collection. And sometimes late at night she can hear her father's voice whispering to her from the forest, telling her to come home, to join him, to stay in the trees forever, where nothing can hurt her and time has no meaning. The forest doesn't forget. It remembers every person who's walked beneath its canopy, every drop of blood that's fertilized its soil, every scream that's echoed through its vastness. And in some places, in the deep wild where humans rarely go, something else remembers too. Something that's been collecting, preserving, and waiting since long before we built our trails and ranger stations, and pretended we had tamed the wilderness. 5 stories. 5 rangers who saw behind the veil and can never unsee what they witnessed. They continue their work because someone has to. Because if they walk away, if they stop bearing witness, then the disappearances continue with no one to document them, no one to remember the lost, no one to warn the rest of us that the wilderness is not empty and that we are not alone when we walk beneath the trees. So the next time you're in the forest, pay attention to the feeling of being watched. Don't dismiss it as paranoia. Look for the signs that others have left behind, the symbols carved in bark, the stone circles and clearings that shouldn't exist, the structures woven from branches and impossible configurations. And if you hear voices calling to you from the darkness, voices that sound like loved ones or children at play, remember these stories. Remember that the forest keeps what it takes and is always hungry for more.